Not a lot of enthusiasm. Dr. George Ray in the kitchen asked me to convey his greetings, and he had a message. He said, for those in the audience who might be University of Arkansas fans, Mississippi State fans, Auburn University fans, Ole Miss fans, and especially, he said, especially the LSU fans, please don't hold it against us this fall when the Texas A&M Aggies run the table in the SEC. Alabama fans too.
The only reason I know I was saying the thing except for 60.
Well, I'm happy to be here today. My title or my topic is Pecan Orchard Rejuvenation. And it's not a lot of new stuff in this. It's hopefully dressed up and packaged a little bit differently than maybe you've heard it before. Maybe that'll keep you awake and keep you interested. I'll start by saying with a couple of quotes, and these first couple of slides will be something you can write down, and the rest of it maybe or maybe not. Solitary pecan trees are good teachers. And what are they teaching us? They're teaching us it's not the tree that's the problem. If you've ever had a solitary pecan tree that's out with lots of space, all by itself in a pasture, not overrun by buildings, other trees, other vegetation, they tend to be pretty good producers throughout their life. I've passed some trees along the Interstate 20. Last stretch. They look beautiful. They're healthy. They don't have a lot of disease problems. And they're an example to us. It's not the tree that needs to be rejuvenated. It's the orchard. It's the system we created to grow them in. That's the problem. Now, this is a bit of a borrowing from Dr. McKitchen, a statement I heard he made a long time ago when I was a graduate student. When I asked him if I could use this, he didn't even remember making the statement. He said, people ask me to tell stories that I don't even remember telling. He said, I make this stuff up every time I go to a meeting. So, but he said a long time ago, he said, if you have a pecan orchard that you want to take and have a family reunion in the pecan orchard in the middle of the summer because it's shady and a good place to get together in the middle of the summer, it's a nice park and it's a bad pecan orchard. Pecan orchards that have got a lot of shade and it's pretty and you can walk out there in the summer. That's not what we need for the pecan business. So those two statements, remember those two things. The rest of this talk, maybe you'll get something out of that too. Rejuvenation, which means restoring vitality. You know, sometimes you want to go take a shower to get rejuvenated, and then sometimes you want to go see a plastic surgeon to get rejuvenated, to look younger and feel younger about yourself. So we can put all these things into this topic, but it's a need for underperforming orchards. The trees will be fine. It's the orchard that needs to be changed up, shaken up, and improved. Starts with tree crowding, and if you don't address tree crowding, because that's the number one difference between a solitary pecan tree and pecan trees in orchards. They got other trees around them. And we can assess crowding. We've done it. Our scientists throughout history of studying pecans have got mathematical formulas. We can look at cross-sectional trunk area. We pretty much agree today. Just walk out in the orchard in the middle of the summer in full sun, no clouds in the sky, and look at the amount of shade on the orchard floor. It needs to be right in this 50% minimum range. We don't want 40% shade. We don't want 30% shade. We need good sunlight in the orchard. It is an indicator of the amount of trees on an acre and how much they are encroaching upon one another, how much they are moving away from being solitary trees and becoming a forest. So, just as you see in this picture, you just simply walk out and you have to do a little mental transformation, estimation. It may mean you need to go get somebody who's never been in your orchard ever maybe a friend, and I wouldn't bring your banker, but bring somebody out there to say, tell me, is this 50% shade? Is this 40% shade? What do you think it is? And maybe you get 3 or 4 people, because we, the owner, the operator, the farmer who grew this orchard, we want to look at it and go, yeah, I think it's still 50%. I still think I'm okay. So you got to get an unbiased assessment of the sunlight on the orchard floor. We have today really 3 approaches that I'll talk about in terms of correcting crowding. And it's systematic tree removal. Every other tree, or every tree, goes away. I mean, just we follow it, we don't think much, and we just start cutting down trees. The second is a little more thought-engaged approach, where we're going to pick and choose the trees that we take off. And I learned this from Bill Goff, and we've been doing this in native orchards in Texas a long time. We keep the good trees and we try to get rid of the bad trees in a native grow. And then thirdly, we can cut on all the trees. We can prune all the trees and develop a system for keeping that sunlight 50% or better on that orchard floor. So let's talk about these 3. This is the Baggett family. Pat Marguerite Baggett and their county agent. This is in Washington County, Texas. They planted an orchard at 35 by 35, most common tree spacing, pecan tree spacing in Texas, at about 17, 18 years. These were people who had been good students and going to conferences just like you're here today, and they recognized with inferior soil and marginal water that in about 17, 18 years, something had to go. They had too many trees on that plot of land. And so they took them out in a systematic fashion on a diagonal. We take a square pattern, we take every other tree on every other row, that creates a diagonal slash through that orchard, and you can see the effect that it creates space in that orchard. Some people would argue, now my sunlight is too high, and I'm in the pecan business, not the sunshine business. And I understand that, and that's one of the problems we have. We let it get too crowded, then we thin it, it's too thin, and it grows back, it's just right, then it starts to crowd, and we go back through the process. Well, what do we have as a solution? Well, maybe hedging is a solution, where we kind of keep it static, and that's somewhat up for debate. But that's one system. One of the challenges, and one of the reasons that we walk out there and want to say, well, it's still 50%, is that we don't like to cut down trees, and cutting down trees is a big job, and it's hard work, and you got to have a place to get the trees to and cut up and dispose of once you get them down. I included these pictures. This is a little demonstration day we had down in a Gulf Coast Texas orchard, and a man with a bobcat or a skid steer made a believer out of me. And in Texas, and I have my wife has an uncle who has one of these devices for roguing out mesquite. We deal with mesquite trees in Texas, and they're tough to get rid of. And they have made all kinds of contraptions to go on these skid steers and bobcats to get rid of mesquite. And guess what? You can cut down pecan trees and get rid of those with these contraptions as well. And you do it in seconds. And so this is just a picture of a man. He walks up, he's got a saw in front of this, and he cuts this tree down in about 5 seconds. And it's on the ground, and he has a way to grapple that, pull it out. So if you're a one-man crew in a small orchard and you need a tool to clean out an orchard, a bobcat or a skid steer might be the trick. And they'll cut big limbs off. They'll do all kinds of impressive work in a pecan orchard. The problem, when we talk about this dynamic changes in tree density, the other problem we have is when we're systematically removing trees, is we may be leaving trees that we shouldn't even be leaving. There are old pecan varieties and some new pecan varieties that are not good long-term players that you need to invest much in terms of rejuvenating. And maybe that's success, and maybe that's Mayhem and more. If these are your favorite varieties, just ignore why I'm showing these here at this point in the presentation. We can make good pecan varieties out of many of these with the right management and thinning. And by and large, you need to assess and understand the difference among varieties in terms of market acceptance, quality problems, whether they're rejuvenated or not, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe you've got some that don't need to be rejuvenated. This is a slide that Dr. Goff, I borrowed from him a long time ago. Bill, which one of the, I asked Matt, he didn't know if that was he or one of your brothers or some other kid in the orchard. Is that? That's Nathan, which is the youngest of four. The Goff boys have probably would be accomplished graffiti artists because they've been in a lot of pecan orchards, spray painting X's and numbers on tree trunks. And Bill has really championed this approach where we go in and evaluate tree by tree whether the tree is good, whether the tree is not good, whether it's a more or a variety or a seedling that needs to come out, and we disregard spatial in terms of regular spacing, uniform spacing among trees, and we try to remove trees that are inferior in terms of condition, inferior in terms of variety. And we remove a certain percentage over a period of time. We introduce sunlight into the orchard. We accomplish it similar to tree removal. It's not as uniform, but it does accomplish improving or rejuvenating the orchard. And this is just a spreadsheet I did when I worked for Auburn. And this was a little orchard, and they had replanted after hurricanes. It was all crowded, and we did some of this type of assessment where it's not uniform, but we reduce the tree numbers. The message is reduce the crowding, or you really shouldn't continue fertilizing, weed management, all those other things. Crowding really is the linchpin to rejuvenation. Both of these approaches offer opportunities to replant to new varieties. And maybe there's upcoming varieties that look promising. If you're not removing a tree and you're staying in the same spatial boundaries, you don't have opportunities to replant unless you're removing something, whether it's selective or systematic. I think Bill's going to address this, so I'm not going to get into the replanting approach. Let's talk about hedging. I think this is Charlie Graham's slide from years ago. We get to borrow one another's slides, and they show up for years in somebody else's presentation. So Charlie took this, and this was a hedging study that went in down at Shreveport, and they're using a Gillison sickle bar type hedger. It's an affordable hedger for small growers if you start early and you're not trying to tackle large diameter wood, as indicated here. This is a toll machine. It's an Israeli-made machine, very expensive machine, not affordable to the small grower, but there are custom hedging operations throughout the pecan belt now. I would suppose that there is some hedging and custom hedging that's going on even in the southeast. This is a project that I started working on this year down in Fort Bend County, Texas. An orchard was planted at 35 by 35, and then after 10, 12, 15 years was just let go and hadn't had anything done to it. And we're comparing hedging with this machine versus some tree removal. We're trying to monitor all the costs, compare production off these trees, and create kind of an economic assessment of the two approaches. There is debate in the industry where you come out ahead. It kind of depends on what you start with and where you are, what kind of soils, what are the driving factors behind basic productivity of a tree have an impact on which of these approaches is better. I'm just telling you these are your three approaches to getting crowding corrected in a pecan orchard. Just on an FYI in terms of cost, this machine and this operation, this is a 100-acre orchard, $275 an hour. They were able to hedge about 1.5 acres per hour, so that's about $180 per acre cost. We hedged a lot of this orchard. Typically you'll get into some type of rotation, and your costs may not be this high each year, depending on that rotation, how often you're going to be hedging. There's also quite a bit of cleanup. We saw Matt out in the hallway earlier, and they did some hedging, and he was surprised by the amount of hedging. And typically, the first time you ever have an orchard hedge, you have that response. You are creating massive amounts of wood that has to be accounted for, chipped up, burned, etc. Our tree removal, we had about a 5-man crew, and they were able to cut down about 8.6 trees per hour, chainsawing and dragging, and that works out to be about $200 an acre in terms of labor. We haven't worked out all of our equipment, minor equipment costs that are associated with that. But you're incurring a cost to make this correction and start down this road to rejuvenation. It's going to have years of benefit depending on which route you go. Challenge with hedging is that we can't do it once. I tell people once you start hedging, you're on a treadmill from then on. You've got to continue to practice hedging on some type of rotation, alternate rows, typically about a 4-year rotation. That tree gets entirely hedged over about a 4-year period of time. So it doesn't work doing it once. You dehorn a tree, it grows back like this. We have compensatory rank growth. It's not productive, and that doesn't help you stay in the pecan business. It's important to point out in this discussion, we're about to switch into nutrition, that we don't want this. We want the rejuvenation. We want the vigor of the tree, but we want our wood to be able to bear. And that all depends on carbon to nitrogen ratios. And we have low carbon, high nitrogen ratios. We typically have vegetation and growth and maybe not so much productivity. We have high carbon and very low nitrogen. We'll be reproductive, but we're not making a lot of wood that allows us to have yield and production. We have to strike a balance in a pecan orchard. We need growth and we need reproductivity both. And so it's a careful balancing act that we have to try to strike. Second phase of rejuvenation is jumpstart your nutrition. If you're working with an orchard that's been neglected or is in decline, is not productive, carefully evaluate nutrition in an orchard. Starts with taking soil samples. If you've got July leaf samples to work with, that's great. If you don't, starts with a soil sample and soil analysis of the nutrition in that soil. This is an example from our Fort Bend County orchard. Has not had any fertilizer in it probably for about 25 years, had some grazing, a little bit of leasing, maybe some nitrogen applied here and there to support the grazing, leasing operation that went in there. So this is what we get back. This is the Texas Agri-Life Extension soil report. Tell us pH and nitrate, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. There'll be some other things associated with that. Came back in pretty good shape. We only had a recommendation for phosphorus and nitrogen, of course. The recommendation from our soil testing lab is 140 pounds of N per acre for that year. Nitrogen is where it starts to try to get this carbon to nitrogen ratio back where you need it so that you're making yourself young again as a pecan orchard, trying to restore the vitality in that orchard. In Texas, our standard annual orchard rates range from 80 to about 200 pounds per acre. That's what's in our Texas Pecan Handbook. It's dependent on variety and crop load. Standard timings of bud break, May, July, August. A lot of people have different timings. The rate and getting the nitrogen in that orchard, getting it to the trees is critical. If you are dealing with an orchard that's been unmanaged for 5 years or longer, you really need to consider being at the high end of this recommendation to rekindle growth and vegetation, push that carbon-nitrogen ratio towards the nitrogen side, and restore some canopy and some future bearing terminals in those trees. A lot of interesting work on nitrogen that's come out of pecan science in recent years. And the bottom statement here is that we're finding that a lot, as much as 90% is what the tree will take up in a given spring is going to be used the following year. And we used to think it would all happen the year that every year was distinct, and we fertilize this year, and maybe next year we don't have a crop, we're going to get out of the pecan active management and not even fertilize the year we don't see a crop. Well, now we see more of a carryover effect. We've got to be thinking years ahead. We've got to be thinking of these trees as the biennial plants that they tend to be, the alternate bearing plants they tend to be. And if you rejuvenate an orchard in 2013, you don't have a crop, you will likely, depending on the inputs you make, should be thinking about an on crop in 2014. And so this nitrogen you put out is going to grow trees, spur some growth, and also be available for those trees in the following year towards producing, hopefully, an on-year crop. Phosphorus, again, we're beginning to pay more attention to phosphorus, and as I showed in this slide, we needed phosphorus in this orchard we're rejuvenating. It is an important macronutrient involved with energy storage. It's involved with blooming plants and return bloom, and it's involved with vegetative growth as well, and it's important. Banding applications, there's a lot of work that's gone on in the southeast and in Oklahoma. If we have a deficiency in phosphorus, we may be applying as much as 100 pounds PTO5 per acre, and more folks are banding that rather than putting that out as a broadcast application. You need to also give consideration to potassium, which has a lot of important functions, water movements, the monoconductance, utilization of nitrogen. Our pecan developing fruit, as we get into the late stages of development, when pecans are really making kernels, but they are high in potassium, largely in the shucks, and so we must have good and ample supply of potassium available to the trees. It takes a while as we start reapplying potassium in an orchard to get it back up and available to the trees. So we need to, especially clay soils, we need to start today getting potassium corrected once we know that it's needed. Typically 100 pounds per acre if the leaf levels are showing that it's deficient. Banding is happening with potassium as it is with phosphorus. Zinc. NPK, zinc, there are certainly other elements out there, but the first four we think about are the big three, and then with pecans it's zinc. And inattention to zinc can lead to the zinc deficiency, reduced leaf area. Reduced leaf area means reduced energy production, translates ultimately down into nut production, pecan quality, etc. Zinc fertilizer, typically we're using zinc sulfate wettable powder, possibly zinc nitrate. I'll tell you, I've been concerned recently as we give meetings in Texas and we talk about zinc products, and we're on more alkaline soils, and the need for foliar zinc is more critical than perhaps it is in the southeast. What I find, and people come to me with labels of products that they are buying from fertilizer companies and dealers, and they are problem products. In both the labeling on the product, telling you what's in it, what form of zinc is in it, and we have a lot of misapplication of zinc due to product availability. It's amazing to me how many people have a challenge finding basic zinc sulfate wettable powder in a 30, 40 pound bag. I just have many growers tell me they have a tough time finding. I don't know why. But if you're using odd products and you go to a fertilizer dealer and he tells you, I've got some stuff in a jug, it's a good product, this will work just as well as zinc sulfate, I'm telling you, there could be a problem with that particular product. We need, those of us in extension research need to perhaps provide a little more information in that area. Zinc is critical. This is the late Dr. Benton Story's old slide set. And he typically recommended about 5 sprays of zinc beginning at green tip, and a couple weeks after that, 4 weeks after that, catch it at case-bearer time, and then about 12 weeks after bud break would be make about the 5th application of zinc to have good foliage and have your leaf area up where it needs to be. Of course, as you get through the middle of a growing season, you come to the month of July, leaf analysis is very critical to the next year's decisions that people make regarding all of these pecan elements. So collect leaves in July, and that provides tremendous power to you in terms of decision making on fertilizer and nutrition. Next, we'll talk briefly just a little bit about vegetation management. One of our Alabama growers, Mr. James Tucker here, this picture is from Uriah, Alabama. A lot of people are always surprised to see the brush and vegetation that had taken over an orchard that he bought and began to try to rejuvenate. And no question, we have a tremendous challenge with brush and vines in orchards that have been neglected. It can be a challenge to extract them out of this type of overgrowth. We had a family come to me at our Texas Pecan conference last year, and they said, we want you to know that we bought some land. We didn't know we were going to be pecan growers. We bought a piece of land that had a mesquite. Again, Texas, mesquite, we don't get far from that conversation. And they said, we bought a mesquite patch. That's what we call them, mesquite patches. They're mesquite tree orchards is what they are. But as this couple bought a mesquite orchard, and the brush land clearing man, the contractor came and says, do you know that you have a pecan orchard in this mesquite patch? And they didn't ever know there was a pecan orchard laid out in rows that was overgrown with mesquite. And they cleared it out in painstaking effort. But guess what? You can reclaim a pecan orchard. It's covered up with all kinds of vines, brush. It's not easy, but it can be done, and they can survive that, and they can come back. This is our Fort Bend orchard. It had every kind of vine that you don't want to deal with: poison ivy, and Virginia creeper, and greenbrier, and blackberries. They had a little bit of everything, and that is a challenge to deal with in a pecan orchard. You've got to get vegetation under control if you plan for the trees to be healthy and you plan to harvest a crop. What weeds you're dealing with, what brush you're dealing with drives the tactics, the strategies for control and reclaiming that land. We've got selected post-emergent herbicides, we've got non-selected, we've got pre-emergence, we've got a lot of tools available. And we were talking at lunch today about some problems with a herbicide called Allium out in the west. And I was telling Charlie and Charles Rowland that when I give presentations, I often tell pecan growers to use the old herbicides. The old herbicides, the ones that have been out since the 60s, all the lawsuits have all been worked out and settled and passed. It's the new products coming along we have to be a little bit cautious about as we bring those in and begin to implement them. Herbicides can have long-lasting consequences, and we have to be careful and stick with things that are labeled. I don't have time to run through these products you're aware, I'm sure, of pecan herbicides that are available. Just in the discussion of brushes, we don't really have any of these brush herbicides that are labeled for pecan orchards. They're dangerous to use. They'll kill pecan trees if they're applied in the right manner. So be cautious as you deal with some of these problems. Perennial brush species, vines, perennial vines, that you are careful about utilization of something like remedy, etc. Water certainly should be part of the discussion. Water is vital to increase root mass. Often pecan orchards that have been neglected, especially those where you've incurred drought, and you retain this big canopy on a tree. When a root system suffers, we've got to restore root mass. Quantities, presence of roots has got to be there for an orchard to be vital, to act and produce as they did when we were young, and so water is certainly key to that. A lot of things that happen when water is limiting, everything from smaller tree rings, reduced growth, leaves will suffer, fruit will suffer, twigs, branches will die, and we have a lot of evidence in Texas that the entire tree of a pecan will die. It takes a few weeks, depending on the severity of the drought, but you can kill them completely. And if you're not killing them and you have low levels of drought stress, you'll have all sorts of water-related problems on the crop, from wafers and shuck dieback, things you heard about this morning, sprouting. We've got to get water in proper amounts in a pecan orchard. You have the advantage in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi of good rainfall through most of the year, but it just takes a week of dry weather to set you back in terms of kernel development and optimal growth. So we typically in Texas say moderate, medium-sized berry trees, 150 gallons a tree per day. You have 35 of those on an acre. That's 1.35 acre inches per week. Increase that for an on crop, 40 to 50%, which means you need to be able to deliver 2 acre inches per week in certain weeks of the pecan season each year. Especially mid-August to late September, where you're developing kernel and you want to have a good finished product. What can you do in an established orchard? It is a bit of a formal job to retrofit and put in a pecan irrigation system. but it can be done. We have growers in Texas who are desperately putting in, out of necessity, putting in irrigation systems or upgrading irrigation systems that have not been sufficient to get them through the last 2 or 3 years of drought. We've got good drip tubing today. A lot of people go into multiple drip lines, 2-line drip, a drip line on either side of the tree row. You can plow that in. May require a root plowing down 12, 14 inches to be able to get that and get that tubing down where you want it. But these are things that can be done. Lastly, in orchard rejuvenation, we've got to get control of the diseases and the insect complex that develops over time in a growing, aging, mature, and especially crowded pecan orchard. In the southeast, we've got to be concerned with not only scab disease, but a number of foliage attacking problems, downy spot, nursery blight. There's a list of minor fungi that if you're not controlling those, your orchard will look old and behave as a stressed orchard every year unless you get these things under control with products like Charlie mentioned in the last presentation. So that's very, very critical. I tell you, and I've not been involved with the pecan industry as long as some of you in here, but our product availability today is incredible. There are an incredible number of fungicides to choose from and insecticides to choose from for pecans today. We're fortunate. I think that pecan as an industry is on the radar of some of these chemical companies that want to make products available, and that's a good thing for you and I. A lot of different things for us to choose from. Insect management has got to be there, as well as disease management. All of that revolves around having a good sprayer. Well-calibrated sprayer is critical to getting an orchard rejuvenated, producing good quality pecans. That's it. Any questions? Matt?
You said that in order to make trees that maybe have been abandoned or are poorly cared for or vegetate more quickly, that it needed a high nitrogen to carbon ratio. How do you determine that ratio?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's one of those professorial ivory tower statements where we talk about things out of plant physiology handbooks. There is tissue assessment of the carbohydrate status, and Charlie's done probably. I'm looking around the audience of who has done carbohydrate analysis in the room. Charlie, you want to comment on this? I mean, we have kind of visual understanding of that ratio. We want to get down into details of it. There's certainly carbohydrate analysis that we can do, looking at structural carbohydrates versus the presence of nitrogen in that tissue. Basically, you can take, just as you digest leaves and break those down and get extraction of nitrogen on a dry weight basis, we can do that with twigs, stems, roots, whatever tissue we want to do that. The problem is baseline references to look back at and compare that to.
The reason we're going to have, there's not really that much data out there to say